Well, thank you, Mike. First of all, thank you for inviting us both here. It's a pleasure, and we're excited to share the film with all 50 plus of you. Let me give you a little bit of a background on myself and Nathan. We both worked for many years at St. Xavier University, and he was chair of the art and design department. I was a member of the history department. And although we didn't work very closely together for about 10 years, I ended up making a film on Stephen A. Douglas, who I had written about in my work. And he ended up being a critical um, a component of completing the film and improving it a great deal, given his extensive knowledge and skills in video. And we developed a friendship from that point, taught film together, and have actually just recently completed a second film. And so this film we thought was an opportunity for your participants not only to think about Douglas, because it's a biography of Stephen A. Douglas, to not only think about Douglas historically, but also to think about the process of filmmaking, which is a very different thing than the process of writing about history. And so Nathan's here, and we can both take questions on that entire facet of the process, which was how did this thing get made? What kind of choices shape the making of a film, and so on. And so with that, let me turn it over to Nathan. He'll have a few comments to make as well.
Yeah, thank you all very much for the invitation. I think the most interesting thing that comes along with video storytelling or movie making is that you really have to sort of be attuned to both the story that you're trying to tell. In this case, it's a history, right? As opposed to a narrative or as opposed to a piece of fiction. But this is a history. So we have the story, and that's probably what we're very used to in terms of reading. We've also watched a lot of TV, and we recognize that there's this visual stimuli going on at all times. One of the things that's a little trickier that we ran into in the process of building something you could keep your eyes open for is the fact that there wasn't an enormous amount of images that directly tied to Stephen A. Douglas. We had to be creative in a variety of ways as to how to illustrate the story at the same time that you're listening to the story. So although when I'm teaching introduction to video, introduction to film, I'm asking students to sort of watch in a slightly different way than they would normally watch TV and sort of be attuned to what you're seeing and trying to figure out why that is on the screen and sort of thinking about like what meaning does that have, especially when, say, we choose to show you a painting instead of showing you a photograph to illustrate an idea or something. Just something to think about, something to watch for that might be a little bit different than normally watching TV. So I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen here for a second, and we're going to queue up this film, and I'm going to ask you to just keep your finger on the volume if you want it a little louder, a little quieter. We're sort of putting it out pretty loud just to make sure it's good for everybody. If it's a little too loud, you can dial it down a little bit. The loudest part of the screen's basically the violins you'll hear at the beginning. So if that's comfortable for you, just adjust it accordingly. Let me just stop my video here, and I will run this back to the beginning. The title of the film is Stephen A. Douglas and the Fate of American Democracy.
In 1776, the Declaration of Independence gave birth to a country based on the idea of liberty, the United States of America. In 1789, the U.S. Constitution changed the form of the country to preserve the idea, establishing a more perfect union in order to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Yet the survival of the country and the idea remained in doubt. Over the next quarter century, Only the vast reaches of the Atlantic Ocean shielded American shores from ravaging European powers, while the angry mutterings of internal dissidents revealed the fragility of a union of states. But there was also much room for hope. To the west stretched a vast continent for the taking, whose acquisition and settlement promised to bind Americans to the Union and make the country an impregnable power. For these reasons, 19th century Americans faced the future with an admixture of optimism and uncertainty and a profound responsibility. The Revolution had bequeathed to them a land of liberty. Now, the fate of the land and the future of liberty were in their hands.
Stephen A. Douglas was born in 1813 at a time when America was very much an experiment in democracy. He was of a generation of politicians who worked to make that experiment a success. In humble circumstances, he grew up in Brandon, Vermont, but quickly moved to the Illinois frontier because he saw that in this newly formed land was an opportunity for him to rise in politics, and he believed that that same opportunity to seek a new future on the frontier should be ensured for all Americans. But in the course of trying to go ahead and protect that frontier possibility, Stephen Douglas fought an awful demon, slavery. And it was a demon he was never able to successfully vanquish or come to moral terms with. And in the end, that demon nearly destroyed the United States.
Douglas's father died within weeks of his birth in 1813. And he grew up on his uncle's farm in the Green Mountains of Vermont. He was a small boy, weak and puny, according to his older sister, but he was fiercely independent. Rejecting the life of a farmhand, he apprenticed himself to a cabinet maker in 1828 at the age of 15. Soon he developed pronounced political sensibilities in favor of Tennessee's swashbuckling general, Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans and the first common man to seek the presidency. Jackson personified the nation's emerging Democratic creed, and his bitter contest against President John Quincy Adams roused what would become Douglas's unshakable commitment to democracy. As Douglas recalled 10 years later,
"From this moment, my politics became fixed, and all subsequent reading, reflection, and observation have but confirmed my early attachment to the cause of democracy."
But cabinet making proved too arduous, and in 1830 he began 3 years of schooling in Vermont and western New York, where his family moved when he was 17. Douglas completed 2 years at Canandaigua Academy. Then, in June of 1833, at the age of 20, he departed for the West, where the newly formed states required little or no legal training before admitting lawyers to the bar.
Finding myself in straitened pecuniary circumstances, and knowing my mother's inability to support me through a regular course of law studies, I determined upon removing to the Western country and relying upon my own efforts for a support henceforth.
After traveling to Cleveland, Douglas fell gravely ill, teetering on the edge of death for weeks, and confined to bed for months before recovering.
Upon regaining my strength in the month of October, so far as to be able to walk, I paid off all my bills occasioned by my sickness or otherwise, and found I had about $40 left. I then became reckless and adventurous, and determined to leave the place.
He departed for St. Louis, and thence to Illinois, visiting Alton, Jacksonville, Exeter, and finally Winchester, where with only 50 cents left in his pocket, he found work as a school teacher for the winter term.
When out of school, I was either mingling with the people and forming acquaintances or pettifogging in the justice's court. At the end of the quarter, I found myself pretty generally known as a lawyer in that part of the county, popular, and with money enough to pay off my expenses and purchase a small library.
Douglas was not alone among Americans finding a congenial home in frontier Illinois. In fact, he was part of a surge of northern settlers in the 1830s.
The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 set loose a stream of new settlers from New York and New England into the Midwestern region, transforming the region, but also creating a tremendous economic opportunity for these new immigrants.
Like Douglas, these Northerners sought to climb the economic ladder by speculating in cheap Western land and establishing leadership roles in newly formed communities.
There was this enormous sense of opportunity in the West, that men with a little bit of entrepreneurial nous, a little bit of get up and go, could make themselves in the West in a way that wasn't possible back east. And Douglas had only been in Illinois for 6 weeks when he wrote back to his stepbrother, "I've become a Western man. I have imbibed the principles of a Western man."
One such Western perspective was the conviction of white men's equality, irrespective of wealth, education, lineage, or breeding. All adult men in Western states like Illinois could vote, and all prized their independence.
The people of this country are more thoroughly democratic than any people I have ever known. They are democratic in principle and in practice, as well as in name. Here equality and equal rights prevail, and no man acknowledges another his superior unless his talents, his principles, and his good conduct entitle him to that distinction.
Illinois' democratic environment propelled Douglas's meteoric rise in politics. In 1834, at the age of 21, he made a major speech supporting President Andrew Jackson's 1832 veto of the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, which was the burning political issue of the day.
The excitement was intense, and I was rather severe in my remarks upon the opposition, so much so as to excite the bitter hostility of the whole of that party, and of course the warm support of my own party.
Yet his impassioned speech carried the day and earned him the title Little Giant. He quickly organized the Democratic Party in Jacksonville and shot through the ranks of the state party, becoming state's attorney in 1835, state legislator in 1836, registrar of the land office in 1837, secretary of state in 1840, state Supreme Court justice in 1841, United States congressman in 1843, and United States senator in 1846. By the age of 33, he had risen from obscure origins to the national stage, and from the moment he entered Congress, his life and that of his country would be almost inseparable. Both were in the vigor of young manhood, both were aggressively expansionist, and both were about to make their mark on the world.
Stephen Douglas was probably the greatest exponent in the 1840s and 50s of the idea of manifest destiny, the phrase coined by a Jacksonian editor in New York City. The idea that the white American people were inexorably destined to populate the whole North American continent from one ocean to the other.
In fact, to expand what he called the world's area of freedom, Douglas also urged the acquisition of Mexico, Cuba, and territory in Central America. As one of the leading spokesmen for the expansionist Young America movement, his influence helped to make national expansion the central object of the Democratic Party in the 1840s. It unified Northern and Southern Democrats around a common goal, fueled enormous enthusiasm in Western states like Illinois, and precipitated a war with Mexico in 1846.
Suddenly we're fighting Mexico. American armies are unbelievably successful. They conquer almost all of northern Mexico right away. They conquer New Mexico right away. They conquer California. There are a few setbacks, but they conquer California pretty easily. And eventually they're invading central Mexico and heading toward the capital of Mexico City. Suddenly it becomes evident that we're going to take a lot of territory in the Mexican War. And the question comes up, is it going to be slave or free?
Ironically, despite militantly advocating national expansion, Democratic politicians did not see eye to eye on slavery's extension. And in 1846, a Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, set off a political firestorm by proposing his Wilmot Proviso as an amendment to an appropriations bill.
The Wilmot Proviso was a legislative effort to ban slavery from the territories acquired during the Mexican War. Douglas opposed this measure. It was, however, popular among many Northern politicians because their constituents liked the idea of having this territory reserved for free farms.
Southerners were shocked. They knew that Southern troops had been critical to the conquest of Mexico. They said, this is our patrimony as well. But Northern supporters of the Proviso responded that slavery was a disgrace to the country and that the nation's territories had to be preserved for freedom.
This debate reignited sectional differences over slavery's expansion that had lain dormant since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Compromise had admitted Missouri as a slave state, but also had barred slavery from all remaining national territory north of the latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. Provoked by Wilmot's Proviso, which sought to exclude slavery from all newly acquired territories, Southern congressmen like Georgia Representative Robert Toombs threatened to leave the Union.
I have as much attachment to the Union of these states under the Constitution of our fathers as any free man ought to have. I am ready to concede and sacrifice for it whatever a just and honorable man ought to sacrifice. But I do not hesitate to avow before this House and the country and in the presence of the living God that if by your legislation you seek to drive us from the territories of California and New Mexico, I am for disunion.
Divergent moral views of slavery underlay this fierce debate over national policy.
Our slaves are happy and contented. They bear the kindest relations that labor can sustain to capital. It is a paternal institution. Jefferson Davis.
For most Southerners, slavery was biblically ordained. For abolitionists, it was a profound sin.
Go to the polls in the fear of God and record your votes in such a manner that you will be willing to have the poll books unrolled at the day of judgment. Remember, Christ will say, "Inasmuch as ye did not vote for these poor slaves who believe in me, ye did not vote for me." You know that some of Christ's little ones sometimes escape from the clutches of their taskmasters. We warn you, brethren, by the glorious appearing of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, led by the awful solemnities of the judgment, and by the eternal torments of the damned, do not give them up. Owen Lovejoy.
Douglas considered this language extremely dangerous because the political arena could not possibly adjudicate the sinfulness of slavery.
Douglas refused to discuss slavery's morality and sought neutral ground by urging both Southerners and Northerners to mind their own business.
I have no sympathy for abolitionism on the one side, or that extreme course on the other which is akin to abolitionism. In the North, it is not expected that we should take the position that slavery is a positive good, a positive blessing. if we did assume such a position, it would be a very pertinent inquiry. Why do you not adopt this institution? We have molded our institutions at the North as we have thought proper. And now we say to you of the South, if slavery be a blessing, it is your blessing. If it be a curse, it is your curse. Enjoy it. On you rest all the responsibility.
Yet the moral and political issues were themselves connected to Americans' economic prospects. Many Southerners insisted that slaveholders needed access to Western territories, but many Northerners were equally determined to keep them out.
Northerners were motivated by a free soil ideology, a belief that the territories of the West should be open to humble, ordinary citizens.
Some of these free soilers also were morally opposed to slavery, but that was not the primary thing driving them. They wanted the territories kept open for opportunity for free whites in the North to be able to move west.
Responsive to this public sentiment, politicians found it virtually impossible to resolve the territorial issue. Especially after 1848, when the United States acquired 525,000 square miles of Mexican territory in the peace treaty that concluded the war. This immense acquisition made the United States an emergent world power, but it also caused an almost catastrophic sectional collision. Unless Congress negotiated a solution to the territorial impasse, the Union would surely disintegrate.
The problem was that with the Mexican War, you had Northern free soilers saying that the federal government could and should ban slavery from all territories. And you had Southerners saying that the federal government should allow slavery everywhere. Well, the obvious middle ground, unless you're going to draw a territorial line across them, is to say that the federal government shouldn't do anything about slavery. Let the settlers in those territories make the decision for themselves.
The idea that Congress should not intervene with territorial slavery profoundly appealed to Stephen A. Douglas. Over the next decade, he would become the nation's leading advocate of what he called popular sovereignty, the power of the people to rule.
Sir, if we wish to settle this question of slavery, let us banish the agitation from these halls. Let us remove the causes which produce it. Let us settle it in the territory we have acquired, in a manner to satisfy the honor and respect the feelings of every portion of the Union. Do not insult one section of the Union by bringing forward your prohibition of slavery, nor defy the other by threats of disunion. Bring those territories into this Union as states upon an equal footing with the original states. Let the people of such states settle the question of slavery within their limits, as they would settle the question of banking or any other domestic institution, according to their own will.
That's a brilliant solution. The problem is it's not a national question, it's a local question. And that also is essential to the federal system and to American values, that the people should rule.
Committed to popular sovereignty and confident that it could prevent a civil war, Douglas incorporated the idea into a package of bills designed to resolve the rancorous disputes over slavery. These compromise measures, passed in 1850, admitted California as a free state and settled the critical question of how to organize the remaining land taken from Mexico. Congress was not allowed to prohibit slavery in the newly created Utah and New Mexico territories. Instead, territorial settlers could request admission to the Union with or without slavery in their state constitutions. The compromise brought peace to the country and renown to Douglas. At the age of 37, he was suddenly a national leader. riding a wave of almost unbroken political success. He was a man who perceived virtually no limits to his own or his country's prospects.
For Douglas, and for many other Americans as well, the only way to bind together this continental nation was by building a railroad from one coast to the other, with Chicago as its hub. And in order to do that, you had to politically organize the territories west of Illinois.
Douglas had long been interested in that territory. He had sought to organize it as Nebraska Territory when he first entered Congress in 1844. Presuming American settlement of the mid-continent, he was determined to make the country what he called an ocean-bound republic. Consequently, he strongly supported railroad construction to promote settlement and commerce. In 1850, he had helped Illinois secure a pioneering land grant from Congress to build the Illinois Central Railroad. Now, a transcontinental railroad went hand in hand with his plans for Nebraska Territory.
How are we to develop, cherish, and protect our immense interests and possessions on the Pacific? With a vast wilderness 1,500 miles in breadth, filled with hostile savages and cutting off all direct communication. We must therefore have railroads and telegraphs from the Atlantic to the Pacific through our own territory. The Indian barrier must be removed. The tide of emigration and civilization must be permitted to roll onward until it rushes through the passes of the mountains and spreads over the plains and mingles with the waters of the Pacific.
Yet Indians were not the real barrier to settlement. Southern congressmen were. Reluctant to create additional free states under the provisions of the Missouri Compromise, they had repeatedly voted against Douglas's Nebraska Bills. Their opposition was especially significant in 1853. Douglas's Nebraska bill was close to passage until an almost unanimous vote of Southern senators killed it. Frustrated, Douglas decided to write a Nebraska bill in 1854 that met with their approval. He imagined it as the first step to an ever-expanding American empire, and perhaps to his elevation to the presidency.
To get the Southern votes he needed to pass his bill, Douglas had to appease Southern senators, and their price was to open up the area of the Missouri Compromise to slavery via popular sovereignty.
But most Northern congressmen were shocked by this concession, which repealed the anti-slavery provision of the Missouri Compromise. Therefore, they struggled furiously against the bill, but virtually unanimous Southern support, paired with about 50% of Northern Democratic votes, drove it through Congress as the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
And to repeal that means you've in fact given slavery, as many people said, a new lease on life. It can now go to places from which you previously banned it. That was, a huge vote for slavery.
Douglas knew this would be controversial. He famously said he could travel home to Chicago from Washington by the light of his own burning effigy. It was the breaking of a moral compact. It severed anti-slavery Democrats from the Democratic Party. It helped to create this new Northern Republican Party, and it pushed Abraham Lincoln back into politics.
Well, I doubt not that the people of Nebraska are and will continue to be as good as the average of people elsewhere. I do not say the contrary. What I do say is that no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. I say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism.
Lincoln was centrally concerned with the meaning of the nation, with the survival of the country's core idea. He challenged Douglas and other Americans to ask whether blacks were among the American people.
Stephen Douglas was one of America's greatest exponents of mass democracy, and he genuinely believed that letting the people decide was a very democratic principle to follow. The problem, of course, was that the people did not include the slaves themselves, and that's where Douglas gets into a lot of trouble. Who is making this decision? To Douglas, the people were white settlers.
Douglas never backed down from that conviction. In keeping with the attitudes of most other white Americans, he always insisted that the United States was a white man's country.
Now, let it be borne in mind that every abolitionist and free soiler who opposes the Nebraska bill avows his willingness to support it, provided that slavery shall be forever prohibited therein. They are willing to allow the people to legislate for themselves in relation to husband and wife, parent and child, master and servant, and guardian and ward, so far as white persons are to be affected, but seem to think that it requires a higher degree of civilization and refinement to legislate for the Negro race than can reasonably be expected the people of a territory to possess. Is this position well-founded? Does it require any greater capacity or keener sense of moral rectitude to legislate for the black man than for the white man?
Despite his arguments, Northern voters decimated the ranks of Democratic congressmen in the 1854 elections, replacing them with a hodgepodge of Republicans, anti-Nebraska Democrats, abolitionists, and anti-slavery nativists. Over the next 2 years, pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri repeatedly harassed anti-slavery settlers in Kansas Territory. Hostile to the anti-slavery movement, Douglas defended the Missourians, but at great political cost. Republicans decried widespread voter fraud, the passage of draconian pro-slavery laws, violence against Northern settlers, and the Democratic Party's support for the pro-slavery territorial government. Moreover, Kansas's turmoil quickly caused it to become a battleground between slave state and free state forces. In 1856, the conflict escalated when a pro-slavery posse sacked Lawrence, Kansas, the headquarters of the Free Staters. Incensed, Republican Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts denounced slavery, popular sovereignty, Douglas, and 2 Southern senators in an incendiary Senate speech studded with personal insults.
No person with the upright form of man can be allowed, without violation of all decency, to switch out from his tongue the perpetual stench of offensive personality. The noisome, squat, and nameless animal to which I now refer is not a proper model for an American senator. Will the senator from Illinois take notice?
I will, and therefore will not imitate you, sir.
Mr. President, again the senator has switched his tongue, and again he fills the Senate with its offensive odor.
The speech threw a long shadow over American politics. 2 days later, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks retaliated by bludgeoning Sumner senseless with his cane. The brutal act shocked Northern sensibilities, and with the cry of Bleeding Kansas and Bleeding Sumner, the Republicans swept to victory in all but 5 of the free states during the 1856 presidential election. Even though Democrats carried the South and thus elevated Pennsylvania's James Buchanan to the presidency, an ominous Republican storm was gathering in the North.
The Republican Party was a sectional party, and it represented the frustrations of Northerners that had built over many years. The South had blocked their desires on internal improvements, on tariff policy, on free homesteads for ordinary Americans. Now the South was insisting on expanding slavery into the territories, and many Northerners felt now's the time to draw the line.
And so they built a new major party whose main plank against slavery was keeping slavery out of all territories. They basically took the Wilmot Proviso, said we don't want slavery to take another inch of territory anywhere.
Shortly after Buchanan's inauguration in 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision put Douglas and Northern Democrats in an even deeper hole. Dred Scott was a slave suing for freedom, contending that his earlier residency in territories where Congress had prohibited slavery made him free.
The Dred Scott decision ruled firstly that African Americans could never sue in a federal court because they could never be citizens. And secondly, even more importantly, it ruled that Congress had no constitutional power to ban slavery from the territories.
Led by pro-Southern Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, the court was attempting to destroy the Republican Party. But its decision profoundly imperiled Douglas's political standing in the North.
The Dred Scott decision was terrible for Douglas. Although aimed at the Republicans' attempt to exclude slavery from the territories, if Congress had no power to exclude slavery from the territories, then neither could territorial legislatures. After all, they were creatures of Congress. So if the Dred Scott decision held, in the long term, Douglas's popular sovereigns would have no power at all.
This was a serious problem for Douglas. He now had to explain how Northern settlers could still exclude slavery from a territory constitutionally under the doctrine of popular sovereignty. If they could not, then the Republicans, who promised to overturn the Dred Scott decision and preserve the West for the white man, would surely carry the North in 1860.
And what Douglas basically says, most famously in the so-called Freeport Doctrine in his debates against Lincoln, is that if the local settlers don't want slavery, they can keep it out. And how do local settlers keep it out when the Supreme Court said it should be legal in all territory? Well, they just don't pass laws calling for the return of fugitive slaves. They just don't pass local laws protecting slave property.
From the practical standpoint of excluding slavery, Douglas's position made perfect sense.
All of the apparatus of disciplining the slave force, controlling them, and regulating them, all of that has to be legalized, because otherwise people who don't own slaves would just go and grab a few.
But Douglas's position had no credible legal basis. After all, according to the Supreme Court, territorial legislatures had a constitutional duty to protect slaveholders' constitutional rights.
So Douglas defies the South, defies the Supreme Court, says you can keep slavery out of a territory. Southerners are furious.
Southerners' sense that Douglas was betraying them dramatically escalated in 1858 during the acrimonious congressional battle over Kansas's pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. It was the offspring of the territory's pro-slavery minority who were desperate to make Kansas a slave state. Hence, they fashioned the Constitution fraudulently and audaciously requested admission to the Union under its terms. To many Northerners, this seemed like an alarming pro-slavery plot. After the South took Kansas, Cuba and Central America would be next.
The question for Congress was whether to accept this pro-slavery constitution as the basis for the admission of Kansas as a state. And on this issue, Douglas dramatically broke with the president. He broke with the national leadership of his own party.
The only question is whether the Constitution formed at Lecompton is the act and will of the people of Kansas, or whether it be the act and will of a small minority who have attempted to cheat and defraud the majority by trickery and juggling. If it be the will of the people freely and fairly expressed, it is all right. If not, it must be rebuked.
After investigation, Douglas chose to rebuke it despite unyielding pressure from both the Buchanan administration and hostile Southern Democrats. He then joined forces with Senator William Seward and other Republicans to orchestrate its defeat.
Douglas bravely supported popular sovereignty to its logical conclusion and said, no, I cannot back Kansas's admission as a slave state. And he used his weight in Congress to help prevent its admission as a slave state. There were others involved in this too, but Douglas deserves a lot of the credit.
Fortified by a deluge of support from many Northerners, Douglas sallied forth to do battle with Abraham Lincoln, the Illinois Republican Party's candidate for the U.S. Senate, whose June speech accepting his party's nomination at the State House in Springfield immediately reopened the chasm between Douglas and the Republicans. Lincoln advocated slavery's ultimate abolition, a seemingly radical position that would deeply shape the famous 1858 debates.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new,